midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I am the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I'm super excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Sherika Ekpo. She is the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Anaplan. Sherika, thank you so much for being here. If you want to share a little bit about yourself for our listeners, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how exactly you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Thanks so much for having me, Christina. Hi, everyone. I am Sherika Ekpo. I identify as she, her, and I'm really excited to be here today to talk with you all about so many things that are happening in the workforce. How I would answer the question, what I want to be when I grow up. That is so interesting, particularly because I think that answer has changed over time. But when I ask people to describe me today, they generally use words like connector, educator, or creator. And that's because I'm a lifelong learner and I absolutely love people. But growing up, I wanted to be an attorney. I watched a lot of TV with my aunts and my grandmothers, and I was influenced by a show named Matlock. Do you recall that show, Christina?
I didn't watch it a lot, but I remember the name. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was, an attorney who was always just trying to solve these mysteries. And I really liked the mysterious side of the house. And so the other part of that is, my mom would always say, you can argue your way out of a paper bag. And that's because I would find, my position or my point and then find facts to support it because I always wanted to be right. But over time, I had mentors well before I began my professional career. And that actually started because I was really involved in church in Washington, D.C., where I'm from. And as a first generation college student, I knew that I needed to find some direction about higher education because my parents immigrated from the West Indies. So my parents are from Jamaica and Barbados. And they did not go to college. And so I had mentors who really showed me the way. And they also happened to be attorneys. So I was inspired to pursue my legal education and profession. I graduated from Howard University. But while in business school there, I took my first business law class and hated it. Okay. I did not like all the gray areas in law, if, then, except, when. So anyway, I took that as a key learning and shifted my thoughts to business management and business marketing. And so I wanted to be, an attorney, but I have then since shifted to business, and that's how I've landed in HR because I really love people.
I love that. I bet you are connecting people on a day-to-day basis, and I appreciate the context you're provided in terms of role models and your family and just your path as well. How do you kind of digging deeper? I think your personal journey has really led you specifically to Anaplan and to be the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer.
That's a good question. And I often think about it because, as I mentioned, my parents are not from the US. And so it was always like a fight to fit in. They have accents. And while today it's really cool to be a part of a unique culture, growing up, it wasn't so cool, right? Like if your skin was too dark or if you had an accent or anyone in your family did, people would make fun of you. And so I really remember how that made me feel. And so I would go out of my way to make friends or connect with people who were often left out. And so what I didn't realize is in high school and college, I always joined and often led affinity groups and clubs, like for women or, Black students or something of that nature. And that was really something that, fed into my professional career as I started with JPMorgan upon graduating from college. And, while I went in as a financial analyst, I found myself doing more like HBCU recruiting and trying to help other students of color get jobs in the corporate world. And I was just doing that as a collateral duty. And that naturally progressed over the years to now where I am at Anaplan, and I focus on equity, inclusion, and belonging 100% of the time. So really, this is a dream come true and really a culmination of a number of different initiatives and roles that I've played in the community over time.
I love that, moments of flow, the work that you're naturally gravitated towards. And I think that our lived experiences really kind of affect how we show up and where we
Yes.
are today too as a foundation. So I definitely appreciate kind of you sharing your story with us today too. And when we're talking about equity and belonging and going out of your way to really feel connected to folks who might feel like they are on the margins and organization, we're talking about company culture and just kind of cultivating a place where people can feel like they can do their best work. From your perspective as a leader, what are the ways that we can think about kind of measuring the both in a qualitative and quantitative sense company culture at an organization?
Well, that's a really good question because to understand the health and effectiveness of a company, you have to look at both the quantitative and qualitative metrics, right? And so, for example, my team is responsible for driving inclusion, equity, and belonging strategy at Anaplan. And a lot of times when I talk to leaders, they think about the data, right? But we have to, while it's critical, we have to go beyond the workforce data and those quantitative metrics so that we evolve from this check the box activity. It's just not about how many women you have represented in the workforce or how many Native American and Pacific Islanders you have. We have to think about what the lived experiences are of our employees, right? And so while representation data is important, qualitative data from cultural assessments, listening sessions, employee surveys, all help leaders and decision makers understand what works in the workplace and what's most effective. And so one of the areas that we focused on from a cultural perspective at Anaplan is belonging. And I'm really excited because belonging, essentially, in my opinion, is just about a central connection point. It's all about how people feel in the workplace, which can ultimately drive high productivity and high innovation. So while there's been so much buzz about belonging and what it means, right? I want to figure out as a leader how to put that into reality. And so one of the things that we're doing is looking at different frameworks and strategic partnerships that we're actually developing so that we can really have these evidence-based strategies to drive outcomes. And so one example of that is really just thinking through our diversity recruitment strategy, right? As we're thinking about adding an internship program and really investing in our emerging talent, we're thinking about what it means to go to a historically Black college and university, or a Hispanic serving institution, or a woman college, a women's college, so that we can really target some of the students and future talent that we would like to see in Anaplan. But those strategic partnerships really help us along our goals.
Yeah, I think working with folks in the community, strategic partnerships, and also thinking about the inclusion and belonging piece, that connection, as you were talking about too. We're definitely not fans of box checkers. We want a sustainable strategy, because once you kind of attract talent, you want to make sure that the workplace is set up to support, resource, and develop the careers of people as well. And people are not statistics at all. Every individual is important. So understanding the qualitative data is also important, to your point too. I know a lot of people have been talking about or I should say, some people are talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is really great. We've seen more kind of roles pop up in organizations as well. And there's been a lot of conversation around the Great Resignation, the Great Reset, the Great Reshuffle. And I know we were talking about the article that you wrote in January and how you talked about this as the Great Reimagination, which I definitely love the terminology around, because it is an opportunity to recruit and retain top talent. In order to do that, you need to test new things, not keep it business as usual. What have you tested and changed at Anaplan in terms of retention strategies during this time?
Well, let me just start by saying really smart and progressive companies are using this unique time to adapt quickly and take advantage of the talent shift that's happening, right? And as a company, we've recognized that prioritizing DEI was central to really thinking about our strategies and how we become the employer of choice. And so what I've seen is us really thinking about how to integrate DEI into the entire employee life cycle. So from the first interview, right, from the time that our recruiters reach out to onboarding and making sure that we have inclusion, equity, and belonging training on day one.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Anaplan is really investing in emerging and diverse talent, as I talked about earlier,
Yeah.
right? We're listening to our employees and really helping to understand what will drive retention. And one of the things that has come to the forefront for us is workforce of the future. So being flexible, right? Increasing our recognition programs, offering more career development, right? So as you start thinking about the exit survey data that we're seeing, we're getting ideas and we're asking our employees, what is it that we can do to retain you? And so as a part of our longer term strategy, we're really thinking about how we think about creating this unique culture that not only benefits our employees, but our customers and our partners as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one key piece of that is how we leverage our own platform, right? Anaplan is a cloud-based platform that really helps drive business insights, and it just makes your data more visible so that you can really create an action plan to get to accomplish your goals. And so our team looks at our workforce planning models to understand things like equitable hiring, or what it means to have a representation goal in one area and what it means to get there, right? Because we have in our models labor data from the Census Bureau, as well as employee data from our workforce, we're able to create models that give us the ability to create scenarios that then forecast what types of decisions we should be making to have the representation in the workforce that we want to see. And so as a company, we're really doubling down on our emerging talent and internship programs and leveraging our platform to do so.
Yeah, leveraging kind of that data is really important, leveraging the platform. And you mentioned kind of flexible work and equitable hiring. Can you tell me a little bit more about kind of the idea around job sharing and flexible work programs that really benefit specifically the cohort of employees who identify as caretakers and, of course, working parents?
Well, let's talk about it, because I'm a mom first and foremost. The one thing I tell people is that my most important title is mom. I'm the proud mom of 3. And so flexible work programs to me are a key retention lever, right? And so there are many candidates who are looking for, that level of flexibility. And so we're piloting a couple of programs around flexible work location, right? We've all seen over the past couple of years, you can do your job from damn near anywhere, and so we're looking at job sharing and part-time roles and 4x10 work weeks, because we know that flexibility is key. Like I said, I have 3 children, 2 are elementary aged. And listen, when they have a scare at school or a COVID outbreak, or they themselves are sick, as a mom, I have to pivot and figure out, how to, care for my family first and foremost, while creating some coverage at work. And so Anaplan has been really good at creating that level of balance and infrastructure around caregivers as well as caretakers, quite honestly.
Yeah, flexibility, having that conversation around kind of the why too is so important, and kind of setting that up in terms of a flexible schedule for non-negotiables at an organizational level. It definitely makes a difference. And I know we talked a little bit about this in terms of not just focusing on the diversity piece of a strategy, which is of course important, but also being inclusive. And I know that was one of your calls to action in kind of other like pieces you wrote in terms of being truly inclusive. Can you tell us a little bit more about that strategy and what that really looks like in practice?
Well, you know what? Let me take a step back though, and let's talk about that, because I think one thing that is really gut wrenching for me as a practitioner is that people lump DEI together as if it's one word. It's like DEI, like it's a single word, and it's not, right? They are 3 distinct words that require strategy. Each just require its own strategy, right? So the D is diversity. And really that's just about data. It's the literal workforce data representation. And so while the data is critical to helping us identify any gaps in measuring progress, diversity by itself is just not enough. And I think one thing to note is I did not call my team the diversity equity, and inclusion team. I called my team the inclusion, equity, and belonging team, because so often when people hear diversity and they're not in the and they're not in a minority or historically underrepresented group, they think that you're not talking to them. But in fact, we are, right? And so I really want to make sure that people understand the diversity is important, but individually, it is ineffective without the other components. Let's talk about those components. The E is for equity, and that's simply about leveling the playing field. It's about changing systems to give everyone the fair and equitable access that they deserve. And the other thing that I'm starting to realize, and I think this came to me maybe 2 or 3 years ago, people conflate equity and equality. They're not the same, right?
Yeah.
But you got to understand those subtle differences to make sure that people get what they need when they need it. So equality is giving everybody the same thing. Equity is meeting people where they are and giving them the tools that they need at that time to be successful. And then the I is really about inclusion, right? I stands for inclusion, but that's really intentional action. It's about making choices to include other people's perspectives and values, period, full stop, right? But as I think about it, that's all diversity, equity, and inclusion are all driving towards belonging. It's really about understanding this central connection point in the workforce. And unfortunately, belonging has become like this buzzword. And I'm really trying hard to ensure that at Anaplan, we're working to not only define belonging in a way that makes sense for us, but really use it to drive evidence-based outcomes. And so I know that there is a lot there, but when I think about what it means to not just be inclusive, it really means to make sure that all of these pieces are working together towards a common goal.
Absolutely. The common goal of belonging, the words that you use matter as well, and kind of the definition, defining it in your own organization too, what that looks like in practice is also really important to the strategy. And equity is about fairness. We know the playing field is not level. So understanding how we can individually and from a systemic level make that change is important. In terms of things that prevent belonging, we have all heard kind of that term, people don't leave organizations, they leave bad managers, or
Yep.
unfortunately working in toxic cultures as well. How can organizations really proactively identify hidden dangers like that, or misunderstanding, misaligned goals and values, and proactively find them by empowering folks to speak up?
Well, let's put a little a positive spin on that, right? And really talk about how we can proactively align DEI in the employee life cycle, as I mentioned earlier. The first thing is really creating opportunity or intentional conversation between manager and employee, right? And I think so often, especially in the virtual world, that gets lost, right? Like people understanding what makes you tick, what value you bring to the organization, what are your priorities, how best to communicate. Those are some very basic tips that can really change the way someone feels, and whether they feel comfortable enough, or if we've created a safe enough environment for them to speak up. I think from the very first interview to onboarding at Anaplan, we really try to cultivate those moments that matter, right? And so we try to figure out how to include belonging into the discussion as we start to invest in the culture of our employees. Like many other companies, we have a hotline. We have our HR business partners. But one of the things that I'm really excited and proud of is at Anaplan, we have a group of employee ambassadors who are dedicated to inclusion and belonging, and they help us amplify our vision there, right? They go on to do things like training and facilitation on unconscious bias. We're actually going to kick off some cultural assessment work here next week. So they're helping with the employee engagement piece. And once we get back out into the field and we start really hitting campuses, they'll also help us with some of our outreach to emerging talent. And so having the ambassadors help us amplify the vision is helpful. But another area of safe space that we create for our employees are our affinity groups and our ERGs. And I really find that when I got to Anaplan, we had 6 ERGs. We've since launched a 7th, which I'm excited about. But more importantly, we've invested in the leadership of those ERGs because they are the lifeblood of the company. And in order for them to really help their employees live out the mission or their communities, they had to understand why they were in the role of leadership to start with. And so those groups have created these safe spaces for employees to vent and to celebrate, and to use the opportunity for group coaching, if there are opportunities to share experiences and or get advice from one another. So our ERGs have been a really strong pinnacle of our community.
Yeah, as a former employee resource group leader, I definitely appreciate that. And I think that's a really important connection and piece of belonging at an organization. And I know we've been talking a lot about strategy and tactical ways to kind of make sure that we are operationalizing equity at work. And I think the question always comes up, whether we're talking in a webinar, we're talking to inclusion, equity, and belonging practitioners, is how do we know we're doing a good job? How do we measure that progress? What is your kind of philosophy around measuring inclusion, diversity, and equity initiatives internally?
Well, let me just say this. So I just wrote a piece with the protocol Brain Trust when we were talking about measuring diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what I like to say is you have to give it the same level of effort that you would any other strategic goal, right? And what that means is it requires planning, it requires resourcing, and it requires measurement. And so developing a plan really starts with you identifying some key benchmarks and specific challenges that you want to address. And what is often said and very true is what doesn't get tracked doesn't get progress. It doesn't make progress, please excuse me. And so there's a tendency for companies to like jump on the DEI bandwagon and just start going into tactics instead of really taking a step back and really thinking about what the organization needs at that specific time. The other thing that I see is DEI metrics cannot live in a vacuum. They must align with the broader talent and business KPIs and have an integration point into the workforce models and all of the processes. So, one of the things that I really like about my leadership team is we often talk about how to integrate inclusion, equity, and belonging into every point of the employee lifecycle. And I know you've heard me say that a couple of times, but that's real because it's not just something that we do one time and it's done. It's something that we have to think about. And it really helps us to think through how we tie back to make further business investments. And so one specific example was a couple of years ago when I was at the United States Digital Service, which is a technology startup that was started by the former Obama administration. And I launched the inaugural diversity and inclusion report there. And what it did was it highlighted something that we were so proud of, which was 60% of our leadership team identified as women. And so while that was fantastic for us to see, it also highlighted some other challenges and gaps that we had in representation across other areas of the org. And one of those areas was around geographic location. We were recruiting people from the same part of the country, right? And so we realized very quickly that while we were getting talent from California, and that was great because that was a huge tech hub, we had opportunities to expand our footprint in the Northeast and the Southeast region of the US, which is where I am in Atlanta today. And so that gave our recruiters direct access to the data that we needed to make new programmatic decisions about where our recruiters would go. And so when I think about that progress against measurements, it's really about highlighting key areas and then making programmatic decisions that will help close any gaps that you've identified.
This is definitely a key area that's important for business. It's not just a nice to have, but a need to have. It needs to be resourced, invested in, and time needs to be spent thinking about this long-term strategy as well. And I definitely agree with you. What gets measured gets funded at the end of the day, and that's how you know, what needs to change, what you need to iterate on. We talked a little bit about this too in terms of this being an opportunity during the Great Reimagination to test different strategies, to ask for feedback, and even with the best intentions, people are bound to make mistakes, and that's okay. What are some common mistakes you're seeing folks make in their equity strategy, not necessarily at Anaplan, your organization?
Yeah, I think there are there's so much to talk about here, but the first thing I say is doing this work, right? This inclusion, equity, and belonging work is emotional. It can be draining, and it requires that practitioners in this area are extremely vulnerable. And the truth is, at some point, we'll get it wrong. At some point, I'll use the wrong word, or the language that I use may be offensive in some cases. And someone will point it out to me, and then I'll self correct, right? But it's important that we give ourselves grace, because that is what will help us as we go through this thing called life. It's uncommon for people, to narrowly define what DEI is really all about. And that's my opinion, but I think it's true primarily because it continues to evolve. It is multidimensional, right? And so, especially in the US, many people just think about DEI as race. But at this, I'm at Anaplan, and we're a global company, and it's much more than just about race. And so narrowly defining it that way presents a number of challenges and opportunities that narrow the impact that we can have on the workforce. And so what I have done is really just tried to help leaders think about the multidimensionality of DEI. And, if I'm receiving pushback from an observer or a leader who's uncomfortable, around, about race or religion or other things, I really try to center them on things like generational differences. Because what I have found is that makes people a little more comfortable, because we were all born, and we will all pass on, right? And so that's the one thing we know that happens in reality. And so I think about some of the common mistakes, right? And think about how people narrowly define it. But I just try to make sure that our leaders and our audience understands the multifaceted aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and ultimately understand that if you build it right, if you create a pipeline of talent, if you create an open environment, that you will increase productivity and innovation in your organization.
I think that goes back to defining what diversity and inclusion and belonging really means. And just taking one word, diversity, in the United States is different than what it looks like in Canada, than it looks like in another country. And especially for a global organization, it's important to remember that as well. And speaking of kind of global, we know that International Women's Day is coming up March 2022, and it's also Women's History Month. We should be supporting gender equity 365 days a year, of course.
Yes.
But I definitely want to ask, how are you breaking the bias at Anaplan?
Oh man. So at Anaplan, we're hosting a discussion internally about weaponized incompetence and how this happens at home and in the workplace, because we want to discuss how our employees can support women in the workplace. Additionally, we have 3 of our most senior executives speaking on a panel with one of our partners, Spalding Ridge, in a day-long summit called Women Elevate 22. And, we think that it's really important to continue this work externally as we start to think about breaking down silos that have been created in the workplaces, and also thinking about the bias that women must overcome in order to be successful. But to borrow from a term from our Chief Development Officer, Anna, we're taking a global approach to Women's Day, to International Women's Day. And what that means is we have a global strategy that we're implementing locally. And so we have panels and activities for all regions in the Americas, MEA, as well as the APAC region. And while it is a virtual event, we will have, people and women gathering together to share in this great moment of celebration. But beyond International Women's Day, we invest in gender parity and women's achievement at Anaplan fully. One of the first programs that I launched here was a Women Achieve program, where we've partnered with the Achieve Institute to identify women and help them achieve greatness in their current role, strengthen their leadership abilities, and expand their networks. Additionally, we work with one of our partners, Paradigm for Parity, which helps us to deepen our commitment to gender parity in leadership positions. And so, as you can see, at Anaplan, while we have a number of other initiatives, ensuring that we are not only selecting, promoting and encouraging women at Anaplan is something that is near and dear to my heart, and as well as my leadership team.
I love it. I love to hear all of these examples and programming and really strategic initiatives that anyone can get involved with at the organization as well, from an internal and external lens. Sherika, is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to share with folks who are listening, or underscoring 1 to 2 key takeaways you hope people bring with them after hearing our conversation today?
Well, I think there are a couple of things that I would say. The first is, we're going through a time of unprecedented cultural shift.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we need to be aware that whatever plan that we put in place is not the end all be all. There are opportunities for our companies to continue to grow, evolve, and shift. And as I think about that growth, speaking of growth, Anaplan is really at a place where we're entering a hyper growth stage, and we're taking a hard look at our values. And, we have 6 values that we really anchor on, but one of the ones that we are actually really excited about is inclusivity, because our goal is to ensure that we're open to everyone and that we build a workforce of the future so that we can take Anaplan to the next level. I will tell you, I want to be sure that, as a leader in this space, that I not only continue to create an open environment for my team, for my HR practitioners, but my senior leaders as well. And my goal is to continue this partnership, internally and externally, so that we create an opportunity for employees to bring their best selves to work.
Yes, absolutely. Creating an environment where people feel seen, heard, understood to do their best work. I think the stat is that we spend a third at least of our lives at work. So
Yes.
that is really important. Sherika, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon. It was great to speak with you.
Thank you so much for having me, Christina.
Of course. And as a reminder for folks who are listening, and AllVoices, we really believe in that employee feedback management as a requirement for the organization to succeed overall. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone.